Ladies and gentlemen, if in just a few days a regime that once declared it would never surrender suddenly returns to the negotiating table, if dozens of senior leaders vanish from the chessboard after a single campaign, and if even those holding the guns begin to waver, then this is no longer an ordinary airstrike. This could be the moment that reshapes the entire balance of power in the Middle East. What is really happening behind the hardline statements and the sudden signals of reconciliation? Are we witnessing the collapse of a power structure or merely a calculated strategic restructuring? In the next few minutes, we will peel back each layer of this chess match, from the decapitation strikes on leadership to fractures within the IRGC to Washington's long-term calculations and the reactions of Russia and China. If you're interested in deep, multidimensional analysis that doesn't chase surface-level emotions, subscribe now so you don't miss the next strategic perspectives. And now, let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, in geopolitics, there are moments when the sound does not come from explosions, but from the unusual silence that follows defiant words. When a government that once vowed never to kneel suddenly signals a willingness to talk, that is not just a change in language, it is a change in state. Just days ago, Tehran appeared on national television with a tone of open defiance, declarations of no retreat, assurances that every pressure would be met with retaliation. Diplomatic channels were slammed shut. Messages sent to Washington carried a distinctly confrontational edge. The atmosphere was one of confidence mixed with anger. Then the rhythm shifted. Intermediary channels in Oman were quietly activated. Softer signals began appearing in official statements. And from the other side, the US president declared, "They want to talk." A simple sentence, yet one carrying the weight of an entire strategic shift. In international politics, no one voluntarily approaches the negotiating table while holding absolute dominance. Negotiation is always a sign that the balance has shifted, even if only slightly. So what caused a system once confident in its strategic depth, in its network of influence stretching from the Levant to the Persian Gulf, in its nuclear facilities buried deep beneath mountains, to suddenly signal de-escalation? The answer does not lie on the surface of the media narrative. It lies within the power structure behind closed doors. It lies in the sudden gaps appearing within the chain of command. It lies in fractures of internal trust, invisible yet decisive for any regime's survival in wartime. A government can endure economic sanctions. It can withstand airstrikes. But when the sense of control begins to tremble, when the leadership is no longer certain it possesses full information and unwavering loyalty, that is when the system enters its true danger zone. And it is precisely at this turning point that the curtain begins to rise. Because according to statements from Washington, this campaign was not aimed merely at infrastructure or symbols. It targeted people. It targeted the core leadership. It targeted the very names considered pillars of the system and potential successors. The number cited is 49 senior figures removed from the board. If that figure is accurate, then this is not merely a military strike. It is a decapitation blow to a power structure, and that is where the real story begins. The number 49 is not just a cold statistic in a military briefing. If accurate, it represents 49 links in a power network built over decades. In highly centralized systems like Iran's, power does not operate through simple replacement mechanisms. It rests on patronage relationships, on personal loyalty, on unspoken agreements between rival factions. When nearly 50 senior figures disappear almost simultaneously, the void left behind is not merely empty chairs in a conference room. It is a rupture in trust. Washington has described this as an integrated campaign combining intelligence and precision firepower. Not just targeting coordinates, but targeting schedules, travel patterns, and private meetings. If those claims reflect reality, what should truly alarm Tehran is not the material damage. It is the possibility of being seen through from within. When your adversary knows where you are, whom you are meeting, and at what time, the line between defense and exposure becomes dangerously thin. Historically, decapitation strikes have always pursued two parallel objectives. First, to paralyze immediate response. Second, to plant the seeds of long-term suspicion. Those who step up as successors must deal not only with external pressure, they must also confront a haunting internal question. Where did the leak come from? Huick's shock can sometimes become the catalyst for consolidating power in a harsher form. The real question, therefore, is not only the scale of the damage, but how the system responds to it. At the center of that response stands the force widely considered the backbone of the regime, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC does not merely hold weapons. It controls vast economic interests, political influence, and the domestic security network. If losses among the leadership create a vacuum, it is the IRGC that will determine whether that vacuum is filled with unity or with silent fractures, because a regime can endure the loss of senior personnel. But if the armed force itself begins to doubt, if frontline commanders no longer believe the structure above them is strong enough to protect them, that is the true beginning of a much deeper crisis. And it is precisely here that the story shifts to another level, the level of the IRGC and the risk of internal fractures. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not merely a military unit. It is a pillar of power, the steel shield protecting the regime from both internal and external threats. For years, the IRGC has not only operated on battlefields in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, but has also embedded itself deep within the economy, controlling construction, energy, and telecommunications conglomerates while holding a decisive role in the domestic security apparatus. In other words, if the political establishment is the brain, then the IRGC is the nervous system and the muscle of the entire structure. For that very reason, any tremor at the highest levels of leadership reverberates directly through the IRGC. When 49 figures are removed from the board, what the IRGC faces is not simply a shortage of commanders. It is a question of its own security. If the very top layer can be penetrated, then are the remaining layers of protection truly solid? Reports of dissatisfaction within certain units, of field commanders expressing harder line views, or conversely, calling for a political exit, reflect a deeper reality. In times of crisis, not everyone looks in the same direction. Some believe a forceful retaliation is necessary to restore credibility. Others understand that escalation could drag the system into an even more dangerous spiral. Morale is difficult to measure, yet decisive. A force may possess missiles, drones, and an extensive proxy network, but if confidence in leadership erodes, all material capabilities become fragile. Images of soldiers attempting to leave the country, even resorting to false documents or risking passage through unstable regions, if grounded in fact, are not merely personal stories. They are signals of uncertainty seeping inward. At the same time, clarity is essential amid the fog of war. Not every report is verified. Modern conflict is inseparable from information warfare. A rumor of mutiny can generate psychological shock nearly as powerful as a real strike. But even if only a small portion proves true, it would be enough to compel the leadership to tighten control, conduct purges, and initiate restructuring. And it is within this context that another message has emerged from Washington. Not just bombs, not just precision strikes, but a direct offer to individual members of the system: lay down your arms and receive full immunity. When a force built on the foundation of absolute loyalty suddenly confronts a personal choice between the system and individual safety, this is no longer merely a military confrontation. It becomes psychological warfare at its deepest level. And there, the real battle may not unfold in the skies, but within the minds of those holding the guns. When the US president delivered the message of full immunity for those who lay down their arms, it was not merely a diplomatic statement. It was a drill aimed directly at the foundation of the system's loyalty. That message was not sent to Iran as a unified nation. It was sent to individuals within the power structure, to each commander, each officer, each person standing between survival and duty. In modern warfare, the line between the military front and the psychological front has nearly vanished. A well-timed offer can destabilize more than an air campaign. Bombs destroy infrastructure. Promises of immunity disrupt certainty in the mind. The moment someone begins to wonder whether there is a safe exit for themselves and their family, the absoluteness of loyalty is no longer intact. This tactic is not new in history, but in an age of global connectivity, its impact is amplified. A single message, a single statement spreading across social media and international news channels can penetrate every unit. It creates a silent test. Who will fight to the end, and who will hesitate? Of course, the offer of immunity can also be viewed as a propaganda tool. If no one responds, it becomes evidence to reinforce internal morale, proof that the system remains solid against all attempts at division. But if even a small percentage wavers, a chain reaction can begin. In highly centralized power structures, the most dangerous threat is not open rebellion, it is quiet doubt. And as psychological warfare reaches its peak, a larger question begins to surface. If the ultimate goal is to force Iran to change its behavior, why were previous negotiation channels insufficient to reach an agreement? Why did proposals on the nuclear program, described as clear and realistic, collapse, giving way to bombs and messages of immunity? To understand that, we must return to the failed negotiating table, where proposals that appeared technical on the surface concealed life and death calculations about security and power. And it is there that the deeper roots of this confrontation truly begin to reveal themselves. Before bombs appeared in the sky, documents were placed on the table. There were proposals, draft agreements, exchanges through intermediary channels. According to the US side, the offer was straightforward. Iran would completely relinquish its domestic uranium enrichment capability. In return, Washington and its partners would supply enriched uranium for civilian purposes within a defined framework, ensuring energy needs without creating the risk of weaponization. On paper, it was a technical formula, an exchange between security guarantees and economic benefit. But in geopolitics, issues are rarely just technical. For Tehran, enrichment capability is not merely about energy. It is a symbol of technological sovereignty, the product of years under sanctions, and above all, a strategic lever in a volatile regional environment. To give up that capability would mean placing long-term security in the hands of an adversary's commitment. And the history between the two sides does not provide a foundation of trust. The United States' withdrawal from previous agreements reinforced Tehran's belief that any commitment made today could shift with Washington's political cycle. Meanwhile, the U.S. position has been that Iran uses negotiations as a delaying tactic, talking at the table while continuing to expand its nuclear capacity. When both sides enter negotiations assuming the other is not trustworthy, every clause, no matter how reasonable, is filtered through suspicion. Each concession is seen as weakness. Each demand is viewed as a long-term trap. And when trust is zero, technical gaps quickly become strategic chasms. Internal dynamics cannot be ignored either. In Tehran, any major concession on the nuclear issue risks being framed by hardliners as betrayal. In Washington, any agreement perceived as too soft faces fierce criticism within a polarized political climate. Negotiation, therefore, is not simply a dialogue between two nations. It is a balancing act against domestic pressures on both sides. When those calculations fail to converge, war becomes the final instrument of leverage. Not because there were no proposals on the table, but because neither side believed those proposals could secure its future. And from here, a larger question begins to take shape. If the original objective was merely to change nuclear behavior, do deep strikes against senior leadership, and offers of immunity to armed forces go beyond that aim, is Washington truly seeking to modify Tehran's policies or attempting to reshape the power structure itself? It is precisely at this fragile boundary between behavior change and regime change that the true nature of the U.S. strategy begins to emerge, and where the game moves to an entirely different level. In every major crisis, the most important question often lies not in what is publicly declared, but in what remains unsaid. Washington insists that its objective is to prevent a nuclear threat and compel Tehran to change its behavior. But when strikes target not only infrastructure, but also the leadership tier, when psychological warfare unfolds in parallel with military pressure, the line between behavior change and regime change begins to blur. Behavior change is a measurable goal. Halt uranium enrichment, limit missile development, reduce support for regional proxy forces. These are concrete demands, terms that can be written into agreements and monitored. Regime change, however, is an entirely different ambition. It does not aim merely at policies, but at the power structure itself, at the individuals at the top, at the way the system functions. Signals from Washington suggest there is no appetite for a chaotic power vacuum. The lessons of Iraq and Libya still loom large. A total collapse could create space for extremist forces to rise and trigger wider instability. A more plausible scenario may therefore be an internal adjustment, a different face, a softer approach, while preserving the core framework of the state. Yet intervening in the succession process or the internal restructuring of a sovereign nation carries inherent risks of backlash. It can strengthen hardline factions, push society into a siege mentality, and strip legitimacy from any figure perceived as too close to the West. In many cases, external pressure causes a system to tighten and consolidate rather than fragment. The question then is not only what the United States wants, but whether it can control the consequences of that strategy. Every move in Tehran reverberates beyond Iran's borders. Russia watches each development with strategic caution. China weighs its energy and trade interests. Middle Eastern states ask where the regional security balance will tilt if Iran weakens or restructures. And at the intersection of these calculations, the crisis ceases to be a bilateral story. It becomes a stress test for the entire regional order, one in which Moscow, Beijing, and Middle Eastern capitals must all recalibrate their strategies. As Tehran trembles, the first eyes do not turn solely toward Washington, but also toward Moscow and Beijing. For Russia, Iran is more than just a regional partner. It is a link in the broader structure balancing Western influence, a tactical ally in Syria, a source of weapons and defense cooperation at a time when Moscow faces pressure on multiple fronts. A precedent in which the United States combines intelligence, air power, and psychological warfare to weaken the leadership of an adversarial state is not something the Kremlin can dismiss lightly. Today, it may be Tehran. Tomorrow, it could be another arena where Russia holds core interests. China views the situation through a different, yet equally sensitive lens. Beijing relies significantly on energy flows from the Middle East, and Iran plays a role in its strategy of diversifying supply sources. Prolonged instability means risk to oil and gas shipping lanes, to trade connectivity initiatives, and to long-term energy security planning. China does not want a Middle East in flames, but neither does it want to see Washington reassert strategic dominance in the region too clearly. For the Middle East itself, the impact is more immediate and profound. If Iran weakens, proxy forces backed by Tehran, such as Hezbollah, will be forced to recalibrate. Israel may perceive greater room for maneuver, yet must also weigh the danger of asymmetric retaliation. Gulf states, long wary of Iran's influence, now confront a new dilemma. Would a pressured Iran become more unpredictable or be compelled toward a more pragmatic regional posture? The balance of power in the Middle East has never remained stable for long. Each shock produces temporary alliances, quiet understandings, and new calculations. What is unfolding is not merely another chapter in U.S.-Iran relations. It is a stress test for the entire regional security architecture, where every state must ask, in a shifting order, where will we stand? And within these unanswered questions, the region's future is being shaped day by day, not only by bombs in the sky, but by quiet strategic decisions made behind closed doors. Ladies and gentlemen, history has never moved in a straight line. Some regimes that once seemed unshakable have collapsed after a single shock. Others have been struck so hard they appeared on the verge of falling, only to restructure themselves into something stronger, more rigid, more guarded. So the question today is not simply whether Iran will collapse. The question is, will this shock cause the system to fragment or force it to evolve into a new form? If the remaining leadership swiftly consolidates control, if the IRGC tightens its ranks and transforms external pressure into internal cohesion, then what we are witnessing may be nothing more than a painful transitional phase. A more cautious, more discreet, yet more resolute Iran in defending its core interests could emerge after the storm. But if suspicion continues to spread, if factions fail to find common ground, if loyalty is eroded by fear and personal calculation, then restructuring could turn into disintegration. And when a major power structure begins to tremble, the impact does not stop at national borders. It ripples across the region, touching energy markets, military alliances, and even the way the world understands deterrence and sovereignty. From the American side, the message has been delivered clearly. Deep reach, precise punishment, and a willingness to combine military force with psychological warfare. Yet each such move also places Washington at risk of unintended escalation. In geopolitics, decisive action can create immediate advantage, but long-term consequences are far harder to control. Perhaps the most important task right now is not to predict who will win or lose. It is to recognize that the global model of deterrence is changing. States will study this episode. They will adjust how they protect leadership, how they disperse power, how they build resilience against intelligence penetration and information warfare. So, in your view, are we witnessing the beginning of a new order in the Middle East, or just another turn in a decades-long cycle of confrontation? Will Iran collapse, or will it restructure into something even more unpredictable? Share your perspective in the comments below. The community's analysis and debate are the most vital parts of this discussion. And if you want to continue following the deeper movements beneath the surfaces of daily headlines, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next analysis. The geopolitical chessboard is not finished. It has just entered a new move.